Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of both Christians and atheist skeptics. We get together once a month and we respectfully discuss important books from both perspectives. Keep it friendly, ask tough questions, but try to be able to learn from things that are outside of our normal echo chamber. And we have a great guest for us for the club this month that I'll introduce in just a moment to you. I am president of Watchman Fellowship and co-founder of the book club. Watchman Fellowship is an evangelical Christian ministry focusing on apologetics or defending the Christian faith. And our primary emphasis is on interfaith evangelism, interacting with and reaching out to people of other religions and worldviews, whether it's Hinduism or Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, psychics, the occult, Church of Scientology. Of course, we do have a big interest in as well in the area of atheism and skepticism. So welcome to the club. And guys, is Bill with us yet? Bill Cluck?
Yes, James, he's with us.
Great. So I'm going to ask Bill to unmute. Bill is our other co-founder. I'm the Christian, the founders of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist. And Bill, I want you to say hello, introduce yourself for us.
Hello.
Yeah, last month we announced last month, but Bill and I just got back from a Christian apologetics evangelism conference in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, and we had the first time we've been able to do this kind of thing, but we had a open talk between an atheist and a Christian, and that went real well. Bill, did you enjoy your time in Albuquerque?
Oh yeah, they couldn't have been nicer. Everyone was so nice. Obviously, they tried to convert me, and I appreciated that. And
hey, but we said wait to convert until after we have our conference
Yeah,
meeting,
really?
right? So that kind of messed everything up if you converted before the meeting.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Bill is, we've been doing this now, I guess we're going on 5 years, over
Yeah,
4 years
that's been
now.
great.
So, and we do alternate books. We do a Christian book one month, the atheist book the next month. Let me pull up the screen. Well, I'll just go ahead and announce. This month we're dealing with a book on mythicism, and we have a very special guest author. It's his second time with the club. He was one of our guest authors the first year that our club came out. This is Dr. Robert Price.
James, your video's off, James.
Oh, is it?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
I mean, it's a fine picture of you, but we like live James.
Oh, boy. Okay, I think we're having an issue with that, too. Let me try. I might have to switch cameras here. I'm not. I may have to reboot because I'm not getting anything now.
It'll be okay if all we have is the picture. I think we'll be good.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Price. Dr. Price is born in Jackson, Mississippi. He's moved to New Jersey. He received a Master's of Theology from Gordon Conwell Seminary, and he earned 2 PhDs from Drew, one in systematic theology, the other in New Testament. He was a Christian pastor at the First Baptist Church in Montclair, New Jersey, and he's served as professor of religion at Mount Olive College. But through that interesting journey, he lost his faith in Christianity and ultimately in even the existence of a historical Jesus. And so he is now a mythicist, and he's the co-author and the co-editor of the book that we're going to be looking at this month. And Dr. Price, welcome back, I should say, to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And tell us about the book that you and John Loftus have teamed up on. You can need to unmute your mic, if you will.
Sorry about that. Wow. Yeah, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Um, as for this book, it occurred to me the more I heard from people that also favored the theory that there was no historical Jesus, the wider the variety of opinions became, where in a sense, a whole bunch of us were not really arguing the same thing, though the punchline, the bottom line was pretty much the same. And it occurred to me, I've been a fellow at the Jesus Seminar for some years, though I've been out of it for some years. But that kind of thing and studying the historical Jesus question makes you realize very quickly that there's so many different theories of who or what Jesus was by those who believe that he existed, that one could uncharitably say, well, there you go. You know, they can't agree on it. That in itself is an argument that there was no Jesus. Well, that cuts both ways because the are many different approaches to Jesus being a mythic figure totally contradict one another. I wouldn't say they debunk one another, but none needs the others. And all of them have some plausibility, just like all of the major historical Jesus reconstructions do. So it is a daunting task to say which one you identify with, if any. Now, that's not that much of a problem for me because I don't hold mythicism as a dogma. I've just found that seems to me on balance to have the most going for it. It makes the most sense of most of the evidence, in my opinion. But of course, people differ. And I don't think that it's proven by any means that there was no historical Jesus. Evidence that would convince me might still come up. I don't want there to be no historical Jesus. I don't think it would be better if Jesus were a myth. And I sure don't think it has anything to do with atheism, oddly enough, because there could easily have been a Jesus even if there is no God. And conversely, if there was no Jesus, there could still be a God. They're very different questions. So I don't mean to be wishy-washy and slippery, but I'm trying to be honest and non-dogmatic about what can only ever be a provisional and tentative hypothesis.
Yeah, it is. It is. It does seem to be kind of on the fringe of atheism. It's not something that there's a universal consensus on it. From my understanding, this idea that Jesus never existed, just without having done a scientific study, just my gut and just some interactions online, it seems like some of the younger atheists that are online are more likely to hold to a form of mythicism. That just seems to be my general unscientific view of it. And as your book points out, there's quite a few variations of different kinds of mythicism as well. But the idea that Jesus never existed at all is certainly probably about half of our atheists that are part of our book club would probably kind of disagree with you on that.
Oh yeah,
so
right.
It's interesting that like you said, you're not dogmatic about it, and one of the things that it was interesting. The first book that we did of yours back I think it was the first year of our book club that we had you on. We interviewed you on video to take some of the questions in advance, and we were looking at one of your early books, Beyond Born Again. So this is back, I guess shortly after you left the Christian pastorate, and you were still somewhat identifying as Christian, but certainly not the born again kind of Christian. So you were beyond that, so to speak, and it kind of looks now like you're way beyond born again. So it's some of your earlier works. You talked about the demythologizing of Rudolf Bultmann and making unliteral some of the miracle stories and stuff, a la Paul Tillich, let's say. Some of the more liberal New Testament theologians of the middle 20th century, and kind of this whole quest for the historical Jesus. So it's kind of like reading the book, your book. It's kind of like everybody, all the mythicists agree that the Jesus of faith is fictional. That there is no supernatural Jesus who performed miracles, who rose from the dead, and so, but it's almost like that's not enough. It's the whole idea of Jesus is still way too dangerous, and so it reminds me of John Wycliffe, where when he got in trouble with the Catholic Church for translating the Bible into English, and it was not enough for the Catholic Church that he died. They had to go back and dig up his body and burn the body and then scatter the ashes in the river. So it's almost like it's not enough to have a Jesus who's just historical. We've got to go back and basically demythologize even the historical man. And so I think one of the analogies I liked that you used was if you go to the Wizard of Oz, there is no Oz, and I think that's what all the atheists are saying. There's no supernatural man behind the curtain, but you're going a step further. You say there's actually no human man behind the curtain either. There was no human Jesus. So did I kind of get that right?
Yeah, I don't approach it, though, as a kind of scorched earth policy of atheism. Some may view it that way, but I don't think they ever act. If they do, they don't admit it. But I have to suspect that. I'm no mind reader, but I think they're wasting their time, because even if there were no historical Jesus, what does that have to do with whether God exists or not? That's a whole different thing. It's a philosophical question. Whether there was a historical Jesus is not. It's a question of weighing evidence and asking, well, what is it evidence for? I was surprised at first, even as kind of an agnostic with religious sympathies. I thought the idea of no historical Jesus was kind of a crazy notion. And I remember reading, I think the first Mythicist book I read was G.A. Wells's The Jesus of the Early Christians. And I had all kinds of and by this time, like I was reading this preparing for a course I was doing in a college for Life and Teaching of Jesus. And as I read this, I had marginal notes saying why I thought the Wells's point here or there wasn't that great. But the more I looked at it, I said, now, he complains about not being taken seriously. I mean, just being ruled out without looking at it, and said, I don't want to do that. I am going to try to be open to what he says and see if I really, in fact, I felt this way. That was one thing that got me out of apologetics. I always said, like, I can't just use whatever comes to mind, like everything but the kitchen sink, to convince somebody to believe in Jesus. I have to put myself in their position and ask, would I find this argument for the accuracy of the Gospels or the resurrection, would I find this sufficiently convincing? Because if I wouldn't, I'm just lying if I use it as an argument for evangelistic purposes. Well, eventually I thought, I'm afraid I don't think it holds water. Well, I had to do the same thing here. Could they be right? Let me see if I can put myself in that position. And it took a good while, but the more widely I read relevant stuff, the more I began to think, I doubt that there was. I couldn't believe it, but I wound up, what does it say in Galatians? The faith he once persecuted, he now propagates. But I've never said, you're a fool if you don't believe in mythicism, or, oh boy, it'd sure be better if that Jesus guy hadn't existed. No. And plus, loads of atheists I know would say they have no hostility toward Jesus. Others would, but that seems sort of crazy to me.
Well, let me ask you this. One of the very interesting things that I didn't even find out about you until right before that initial interview a couple of years ago was that you were a fellow of the Jesus Seminar for many years, and the Jesus Seminar is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 100 or so, typically very liberal New Testament scholars that would gather together, and they're very often quoted by the news media. They will gather together and vote on which sayings in the New Testament Jesus, in the Gospels, Jesus said or may have said or probably said, and which he did not say. And so, if you could just let me know if that's what they say is that you guys would use colored beads, and so if there was a Jesus didn't say it, it would be, I think, a black bead. If he may have said it, a gray bead. If he did say it, a red bead. Is that, do I have that right, or was that just kind of
that's correct? Yeah, it would be red if most of the scholars having put their 2 cents in. I mean, the vote would come after reading various papers and critiquing them and so forth. And if most said that, yeah, Jesus definitely said this, like the prodigal son parable, the Good Samaritan parable, and some other ones. Yeah, he said this definitely. You'd vote red. If you thought, well, there's some reason to be unsure, but on balance, it looks like, yeah, he probably did say this, there were pink beads for that. Then if you thought, well, there's a lot against this, but you can't really rule it out, he might have said it, that's gray. And if you said, no, this is anachronistic or whatever, he can't have said this, it's been attributed to him by somebody else, that's black. The first time I was there, I said, I'd like to propose a 5th color. How about purple? For, yeah, Jesus really said it, but he was just kidding. Like, turn the other cheek, had you going, didn't I? Give away all your money to the poor. No, just joking, because that's in effect what people do. But yeah, that is what we did every time, and it was enlightening and interesting discussion. But I found it too lenient, even at that. They wound up saying that only about 18% of the gospel teaching would actually go back to Jesus, and for some reason, the same number, 18% of the stories, the deeds reported, were historically authentic. Well, I did an article called Dubious Database, where I said, really, if you use the same criteria, a lot of this stuff really falls away, and I don't think they have much of a basis to be sure about anything. But that's not why I left. I left once Donald Trump was elected, and one of the big wigs of the seminar put out this thing saying, well, from now on, our big task is to undo the damage Trump has done. And I said, you're not speaking for me. I'm out of
Well, hang on to that idea, because I do want to come back and talk about that and why you left the Jesus Seminar. But yeah, I think, Bob, you're as far as I know, the only member of that Jesus Seminar I've ever talked to before. And so one of the questions I had is, being a mythicist, yeah, how do you get around your voting on what Jesus said and what he didn't say? I mean, if Jesus never existed, couldn't you just mail in all your black beads? I mean, why do you even need to show up? If there was no Jesus, obviously he said nothing. So was it ethical to go in there and kind of vote on what you thought he did or didn't say when you're convinced he didn't exist?
Well, I wasn't when we started.
Okay.
It was the process of looking at all this stuff, and especially one turning point came when I was reading every book I could find where a scholar would say this or that in the Gospels sure looks like it might be a rewrite of Old Testament material. And the more I looked at this, though I didn't accept every argument from every author, once I was done, I thought, I can't believe this, but it seems like it's quite plausible that virtually every gospel narrative, and some in Acts, are rewrites of stories of Elijah, Elisha, David, Moses, Joshua, and so forth. And I thought, now, what's more likely? That a guy really did all of this stuff, raising the dead, walking on water, multiplying food, or that people rewrote familiar old stories? And I thought, well, it seems to me, Occam's razor, it seems much more like mimesis, as they call it, that it was artful, edifying Christianizing of Old Testament passages. Can't prove that, obviously, but that really turned the corner for me. I thought, well, what is left? If there's nothing if Jesus didn't leave a footprint in contemporary history, if the apparent links between Jesus and figures like Herod the Great and Pontius Pilate and so on are dubious on other grounds, because non-mythicist scholars long ago said, wait a minute, this Sanhedrin trial is anachronistic, it can't be authentic, or hey, hold on, the slaughter of the innocents, it looks just like Josephus's version of Moses' nativity and so on. They never thought of mythicism, but they were zeroing in on these things. It seems to me, yeah, if every one of these seems fictive in some way, does Jesus even fit in with real history? Like some of the same things are said about Caesar Augustus, that the wicked senators tried to kill him when he was an infant, and various other things. But it looks like there an actual person has been mythologized, and there's no way to write the history of Rome without there having been a Caesar Augustus. But it seems to me that you can have the start of Christianity without a historical Jesus. Nobody thinks there was a historical Mithras or a historical Krishna. Most non-apologetic Old Testament scholars now think there was no Moses or Abraham, and it seems to me it's coming to the same realization about Jesus. And again, I know you can't prove it; it's all probabilistic, but it seems to me the balance of it goes towards saying, if there were a Jesus, surely there would be more substantial evidence of it.
Well, Bob, I interrupted you earlier. You were saying that you're no longer part of the Jesus seminar, and that you resigned, I believe, and it had something to do with Donald Trump. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, like they may not believe in a Christ, but they do believe in an antichrist named Donald Trump. And I just thought, this isn't what I signed up for, and I don't think you guys know what you're talking about in politics. And so I figured I can't be associated with a group that is in effect now an arm of the Democratic Party. I'm a member of a group called Republican Atheists. Well, so I left over that, and now, boy, that was just the beginning of sorrows. I don't know if you followed this. There's no reason you should have, but I've now been excommunicated even from critical scholarship because of politics and some things that I never said. I'm being blackballed as a racist and all this, and I don't know where the heck they're getting this, but it's all politics. Oh, I can't appear on a show with this guy anymore. Well, it's like second degree separation in fundamentalism. So, I don't talk about politics unless I am asked. I make a few cracks here and there that are kind of irresistible, but I'm still, that doesn't really affect me much, because I didn't know if I had any professional reputation in scholarship or not. My theories are certainly not mainstream, so I wasn't even sure any of these people had heard of me, but now they have.
In a negative sense. But so one of the things that I think we want to kind of address some caricatures that, we had a book that we looked at earlier, and you guys helped me out. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. I think Seth. It's the book Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Seth Andrews. That's right, Andrews. And so it's there's this idea that if you're Christian, you're going to be a right-wing Republican. You're going to be on social issues, you're always going to vote this way or that way. But if you're atheist, you're going to be extremely liberal, at least a Democrat, if not voting for Bernie Sanders, and you're going to probably drive a Prius. I mean, they have this idea of what all atheists are going to look like and all Christians are going to look this way. And what we find in our Atheist and Christian book club is that's not the case at all. There's a lot of different kinds of atheists, a lot of different kinds of Christians. And we don't want to stereotype or be prejudiced that it's always going to affect you politically.
That's
So,
right, James. There is a rumor that we do have some Trump supporters that are atheists in this group. And James and I have discussed that they should be suspended for at least 2 book clubs. But
that is not true, and you know that.
And I wear that crown proudly.
But there is this idea of painting with a broad brush. Everybody's going to be one way or another based on their theology. So, I've met atheists in the last couple of years who, are pro-gun, that are that are pro-life. I mean, you can't say if you're an atheist you're going to be this way, and if you're a Christian you're going to be that way on every political issue. But if you could just talk a little bit more, it's kind of come to an even deeper level with you. Bill and I were talking about this briefly today, that you're kind of being canceled right now on another front as well. Can you tell us about that, Bob?
Yeah, that's this all started when a guy who was a close friend of mine and frequently recorded interviews with me and with call-in questions too for some 5 years, and amassed this huge backlog of interviews with me. He suddenly got word that some liberal critical scholars claimed that I was an atheist and this and that. I mean, a racist and all these things. And that if he was beginning to interview a lot of other people, well-known, John J. Collins, Elaine Pagels, and so on. I don't know if they were involved, but some of the scholars said, yeah, if this guy is that much of a villain and you continue to have him on the show, none of us will come on again. Well, he was really fretting because this was his main livelihood. And so he called me up, we talked, and I said, look, I understand your position. I'll simply stop appearing on the show. You don't have to, you will not have canceled me, and we can part amicably. Well, I thought that's what was going to happen. But the next day he goes on line and starts defaming me. He had joined the canceled people and he's misquoting me and so on. I was shocked. I couldn't believe this. I still think he just knuckled under, and it's dishonorable. But what the heck? As H.P. Lovecraft once said about a friend of his who was found to be a burglar, he said, "Oh well, just another collection of molecules." Or as the Bible says, "He knoweth our frame, that we are dust." So you can't expect too much out of people, including loyalty and fidelity, apparently. But this really sparked the avalanche. And boy, the stuff I hear about me, is there another Robert Price saying things?
Well, it's really sad,
it's
Robert.
kind of amusing. Go ahead.
Because I really enjoyed you on the Myth Vision podcast with Daryl Lambert, and you guys just related fantastic. He said you were adopting him as a son, and for 30 pieces of silver, he looks like he sold you up, my man.
I think so too, though I do remain baffled as to why he did this when I volunteered to just drop out.
No.
I don't know what, maybe somebody told him that wasn't good enough. He had to make a confession. I don't know, though.
By the way, I want to ask one of our members and you. Terry is the one that is the Trump supporter. I cannot believe it. She can be an atheist. The thing is, can you be an atheist and be a Trump supporter? Can you be a true atheist, Terry and Robert? Go ahead, Terry.
Oh, I think you can definitely be a true atheist and be a Trump supporter. I don't think there's anything in Trump's ideology that would cause you to feel like that atheism has is giving you mixed signals. It's like how we divide all parts of our lives. You know, I'm a yoga teacher. I eat meat. That's against yoga philosophy. Many people do. And in all these little different venues, there's people that are conservative and people that are liberal. And being an atheist and supporting Trump they're not even related. I mean, I can tell you the reason I support Trump, and none of it has to do with religion.
So how about you,
Well-
Robert? Don't you think it's kind of like ridiculous to be a Trump supporter and with the views he has, the ultra conservative views, and be an atheist?
Well, he's not really ultra conservative. He sure seems to be pro-gay. He's made a point of that when he took the risk of saying that, not in quite those words, but it was clear. And then he congratulated the audience. It might have been at the convention where he was first nominated, and he said, "I'm pleased that you're okay with that." He's not, I think, not really religious, but he doesn't exactly say he is. Like, he'll say vague things like, "Well, I'm a Protestant." No committed Christian would say that. You would more readily say, "I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Baptist," or something.
Well, and
that
James was
implies-
at the prayer breakfast, and he goes, in 2 Corinthians, we know we need
That's
that
what
when we're
scholars do. That's common among scholars.
really?
He's
Okay.
not one, but yes, they speak of 1 and 2 Corinthians.
okay.
And I figured that was just a failure to keep up with things on. I mean, he might not know Corinthians from Chronicles. I don't know, but in fact, what he said was by no means.
Okay.
Well, let me do this. I've got some more questions for you, but I don't want to take up the whole meeting. I know that Daniel's got some questions as well, and many of you probably do. Here's what we're going to ask you to do. If you go into text, if you're a member of the book club, you're in the room with us, and you want to ask a question of Dr. Price, if you can go into the text and request, and either Brady Blevins or you can text to the room or individually to Brady or Daniel Ray, and they can get you in the queue. If you would rather not ask the question yourself, if you would like them to ask it for you, just type out your question. But if possible, it'd be nice for you to come on camera and unmute and be able to ask the question. So go ahead and get those questions in. I had a question. We had 3 focus chapters of the book, which were the chapters that you wrote. One of them was a response to a direct response to Bart Ehrman, who wrote the book "Did Jesus Live?" And I know we also had available for the book club a link to the YouTube debate that you had with Dr. Ehrman. So after the debate, let me just ask you, first of all, are you guys still friends? Are you guys friends?
Yeah, we had never met before I guess the day before the debate. We ran into each other in the airport. And he was a very pleasant, jovial, likable guy. And so he was still afterward. And he wrote a blurb for one of my books, and we correspond sometimes. And I like him. I didn't really care for his demeanor in the debate.
I had a question for Robert concerning Dr. Ehrman. You know, there's they have 2 views of Jesus, and both of them believe he was an apocalyptic figure who was, obviously, we know that Jesus didn't walk on water, he didn't calm the storm, from the demythologizers of the German school years ago. We all know that. But they do feel that there's a historical core in the New Testament that, because of the criteria of that he was an apocalyptic figure that thought the world was going to end, and they both came to the same conclusion. We had Dr. Ehrman on a few months ago, by different ways, but they both believe he was an apocalyptic figure. Does that, as opposed to John Dominic Crossan's cynic view, that not that he was a cynical person,
No, I know
that
what you mean.
yeah.
A capital
So-
C cynic.
So which view seems more likely to be true to you, the apocalyptic view or the cynic view of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan?
You can make a pretty good case for both of them and several others. And so it's kind of like what Thomas Kuhn said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You start with a certain body of data and extrapolate from there, and it's kind of a thought experiment. But there are competing ones, and everybody hopes that someone will do a good enough job, a comprehensive job of explaining as much as possible of the data, gospel sayings, etc. in this case, as possible, and not leaving anything out. What is it about what you do leave out? Well, you figure, okay, Jesus didn't say or do this, but fans of his who did come to believe it figured, well, Jesus must have been at least as smart as I am, and I believe in so-and-so, so he must have. People are still doing that today, right? I said it, Jesus believes it, that settles it. But Kuhn said, in the final analysis, judging between the paradigms is almost like a religious conversion. I guess he meant sort of it's an intuitive feeling, and that's not very reliable. And I think that's the case there, because you can make, and Crossan and Burton Mack and others have made a pretty good case for a wandering cynic type sage Jesus. And then you say, well, what about the apocalyptic stuff? Well, you'd say that, as Mack does, that was the contribution of a later generation of Christians once the war clouds began to form. But if you are if you think, no, this is the voice of Jesus, the doomsaying and all that, but what about all the stuff that doesn't seem to have anything to do with that, just wise sayings? Well, they might say, well, this is what happened after the second coming didn't materialize, and so they had to shift the focus. Unfortunately, these are both plausible, and I don't know that it will ever be possible to say which is a better theory. Neither of them is bad. Neither of them seems to me to be cheating with the evidence, and there are others. Was Jesus a revolutionist? Was he a Hasidic wonder worker? There's so many plausible theories.
But John Dominic Crossan said there's two things that are certain historically: that Jesus was baptized by John, criteria of embarrassment. Why is he being baptized? He should be baptizing John. And you see Matthew correcting it. Why didn't he just make up a whole nother story? And the other thing, which Bart Ehrman said in his debate with you, was that nobody expected a dying Messiah. John Dominic Crossan said the crucifixion by Jesus is certainly a historical fact. And Dale Allison said, because the epitaph says King of the Jews, no Christian would have said that. They would have said Son of God or whatever. So don't you find that criteria of embarrassment a strong case for the historicity of Jesus?
Not at all. And actually, that, not that this proves it's wrong, but a lot of people are now saying, wait a minute, that doesn't really work. And for me, the big problem is all they've shown is that one stage of Christian belief finds an earlier one embarrassing. Like it's some scholars have suggested long ago that the baptism is simply what I think Gunkel called a ceremonial etiology. That is, it was not just saying Jesus says be baptized, but if you have a story where Jesus is baptized, you see, it was good enough for Jesus, you ought to do the same thing. But subsequently, people began to say, wait a minute, if Jesus was what we say he was, what's he doing lining up in a baptism of repentance? Well, Mark didn't think that was embarrassing. That was fine with him. It's just that Matthew thought it was embarrassing from a later standpoint. As for the crucifixion, there are several contemporary novels in which the hero is either actually crucified or condemned to the cross, but escapes alive. He doesn't die and come back. He's escaped alive. And and in the same novels, his mate, it turns out, was prematurely buried, thought to be dead, but was not, and was buried in an opulent tomb, which attracted tourists. tomb robbers who found her alive and skedaddled. Finally, the two lovers meet, and each thinks the other is probably a ghost and is amazed to see, no, you're really alive. This seems to me, I mean, they talk about the criterion of dissimilarity. Well, this is mighty similar. And plus the idea of a suffering Messiah. There is a great study just a couple of years old about Messiah ben Joseph. The idea in Judaism that there was a preliminary Messiah from the northern tribes, hence the Messiah ben Joseph, not Ben David, and that this guy had to die in battle to atone for the sins of Israel that were keeping them oppressed by the pagans. Well, he eliminated that stain to prepare the way for the Messiah ben David to come in and kick Roman butt. Well, what this author showed was that in various neglected Jewish sources, the idea of an atoning, suffering, dying Messiah goes way back. It's not some post-Christian thing. And so I think these fellows are just wrong about that. There's scholarship
One issue that I struggle with on the whole mythicism theory, and this came up specifically, we had David Fitzgerald as a guest author a couple of years ago, and it seems like that most, if not all, the mythicists still want to hold on to Paul as being a historical person. And you have First Corinthians, which dates very early, and Paul is saying there that he has a meeting in Jerusalem with Jesus's his chief disciple Peter or Cephas, and that he also talks with the brother of Jesus, which is James, the half brother of Jesus, there in Jerusalem. And it's just like, I don't understand why the myth it's like they don't go far enough. Why would you have Paul being historical? It's almost like you're making an argument that the Chronicles of Narnia are myth, except for the talking lion. Now that part's true, but the rest of it is all mythical.
And that's Galatians 1:18,
you have a Paul, yeah. I mean Galatians, not First Corinthians.
And it seems to be, James, a matter of fact, he doesn't seem to have an agenda, Paul, when he says that, I just came down. Do you see what I'm saying, Robert? That he just seems to say it off the wall. So what do you think of that?
First of all, do you agree that there really was a historical Paul, or is he part of the whole myth story?
Well, I believe that, I know this is going to sound crazy. You really have to sit through a long and tedious explanation of why this is, and I won't inflict it on you, but I do have a book about this called The Amazing Colossal Apostle, not Paul. But I think, in short, that Paul and Simon Magus were the same person historically. Josephus mentions a kind of a mystagogue named Simon, who was attached to Felix, Festus, Drusilla, Bernice, the people Paul is also associated with in Acts. He, in different manuscripts, his name comes closer and closer to that of Emmaus, Bar Jesus from Acts, who seems to me to be a retelling, like a literary clone of Simon. The confrontation between him and Paul mirrors that of Peter and Simon Magus. The Gnostics always claimed that Paul was the source of their belief, whereas the emerging Catholic Church said, no, Paul was okay, but Simon Magus was the origin of Gnostic belief. Well, they're probably both right. It was the same guy, I think. Again, I don't ask you to just believe that, but I do think that there was a Paul. But I also am with the neglected Dutch radical school of critics who believed that just as none of the material attributed to the Apostle Peter withstands critical scrutiny today, and there's loads of it that isn't in the Bible, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Peter, et cetera, et cetera. In the same way, the Dutch radicals like W.C. van Manen said that there was a Paul, but he was such a big name, though he did not write anything. Acts doesn't have him writing letters, that other people wrote letters attributed to him for the sake of the big name. just as you have apocalyptic works ascribed to Ezra and Enoch and all this kind of thing. It was a common thing, the pseudonymous writing. And one reason I think that is probably correct is it seems to me that the so-called Pauline epistles are brimming with serious mutual contradictions, even within the same letter. That the only way to salvage them as Pauline is to say Paul must have been a multiple personality disorder case. That people, whole commentaries are devoted to just trying to iron out the problems. Now, what could Paul have meant here if he went on to say this there? And it's all just strained harmonization. So I think
most of the liberal scholars, that we've talked to, and even atheist New Testament scholars that we've talked with, is they talk about the undisputed letters of Paul.
7 letters.
There's 7 undisputed, and so you have maybe not the pastoral epistles, they're question mark there, but they identify these 7 letters as being authentic Pauline documents. They're early, written by a real person named Paul. Maybe that was a pen name or something like that. That's a theory, but it's a real person. So you're mixing into this myth story an actual historical person who lived, who, according to some, is just about the author of Christianity. It certainly produced the better part of the New Testament.
And James, he does seem to know about the Last Supper, his disciples. He knows doesn't know about the parables of Jesus. He doesn't know about the miracles, but he does know some things, doesn't he, Robert, about Jesus, Paul?
Well, you might remember this from the debate with Bart, or reading his Did Jesus Exist? He says that mythicists are forced to excise as interpolations passages that would militate against mythicism, such as on the night he was betrayed, he took bread and wine and all that. I spoke to no other apostle but Cephas and James, the Lord's brother, and a few other ones. I did some research. Every one of those theories, and some he didn't mention, were proposed by people who were not mythicists and were not arguing for mythicism. They just detected problems in the text, things that seemed to contradict it, interruptions in the continuity of the passage, changes in vocabulary from what we would expect from most of the letter, etc. And just one example, the thing with the brother of the Lord. It's interesting, said a non-mythicist, that Irenaeus, who was reading some version of Galatians before any extant manuscript that we have, is arguing against Marcion, the great Paulinist so-called heretic, and he said Paul was independent of the 12 and the pillars of Jerusalem and had his own revelation. Well, Irenaeus is saying, no, he was a partner or a subordinate of the 12. Well, there are 2 visits to Jerusalem that Paul is said to have made in Galatians. In one of them, he says he met these bigwigs and so on. That's the one that would really refute Marcion if it was originally there. But in his very attempt to refute Marcion, Irenaeus does not mention that. He speaks of but a single visit of Paul to Jerusalem, and it's not the one where he mentions James. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but to me, it's like the axe is laid at the root of the tree. That makes that passage so dubious, it cannot decide a question like this. And this guy wasn't even trying. He was an anti-mythicist, but he suggested this. Can't think of the name now, but I have it in the book. So I don't, and I think a good case can be made for these other things, that they are likely interpolations, and the argument has nothing to do with whether it would be good or bad for mythicism.
But again, at some point, you've got to draw a line and say, okay, all these are fictional characters made up decades after the events that supposedly records, but there's still people, there's still a Christianity, some type of Christianity that Paul's fighting when he was still called Saul, and he he's a real person. Okay, you could say, well, he really was going under a different identity or something like that, but it's not a story that was made up by Luke, decades later. It's contemporary, and you're talking about 2 decades from the cross.
But of course, if Christ was a myth, the bottom drops out of any chronological argument. 20 years from what? From the undisputed life and death.
Well, but Paul's not a myth. This is a problem. Paul is fighting Christianity within a decade of the cross.
Well, let me just explain what I think.
Unless he's a myth. I mean, if you want to conclude him as part of the myth, then at least it would be more logically coherent, I think.
Well, the thing about the story of Paul being a persecutor, which reels in the Stephen persecution thing, that's sort of the premise for introducing Paul. It seems clear to me that this is adapted by Luke, or whoever the author of Acts was, from 2 well-known sources, well-known in the day. One, 2 Maccabees chapter 3, where we read of Heliodorus, a Seleucid official who comes to Jerusalem to steal all the money out of the temple treasury, but he doesn't manage to do it because a couple of angels, one angel appears on horseback and knocks him to the ground, and he becomes blind, but Jewish elders take him in and pray for him. His sight returns, and he goes back up to the Seleucid capital and explains what happens. And he says, and they ask him, well, what do we do now? He says, well, if you want to have somebody convert like I did, you can send them to try the same thing. And he converts by a miracle involving blindness, an angel, and stopping a blasphemous effort. The other one is Euripides' play, The Bacchae, in which the god Dionysus appears in Thebes in human form as his own apostle, and his cousin King Pentheus decides that this guy's a troublemaker and has him arrested and imprisoned. But wouldn't you know it, the door opens by itself, and he comes out and says, rather like Jesus in the Gospel of John, "You have no power over me." And then he causes Pentheus to suddenly hypnotically convert to faith in him. It's just read these things sometime. It's amazing.
I'm not quite following you, Bob.
The story.
Let me back up the question again a little bit. Paul was a real person, not a myth. It wasn't a story that was written 20, 30 decades after the events. Okay. And so he really existed, and he really wrote 7 undisputed epistles.
I don't think so. I've just said I think that that all of them bear signs of not only contradictions between them, as if each is a digest of contrary Pauline views within the school, but also they have anachronisms in them, like Paul referring to, remember the traditions I delivered to you. What the heck? He founded the church 2 weeks ago. What's going on there? It seems like the idea that he says, well, it's too bad that for the time being, Jews en masse have rejected Jesus. Could that possibly have been clear a couple of decades after the start of Christianity? Doesn't seem like it. I mean, Chrysostom was having to tell Christians, hey, stop going to the synagogue on the day before church. It just, it seems anachronistic to me. And so I do not think, I mean, these same scholars are willing to say there was a cottage industry of pseudonymous Pauline epistles, because 6 out of the 7, they say, are false. Then there's no particular reason to assume the others are authentic. And I think there are disturbing questions that show that the lucky 7 are not either. So I think there was a nugget of a historical Paul, Simon, but the story of his conversion, which I might add is never told even in any Pauline epistle, no Damascus Road, nothing, that seems to mirror 2 well-known contemporary holy stories, one Jewish, one Greek. And it seems to me that there's loads of reason to question whether Acts has any factual basis or not, even if there was a Paul.
Yeah,
Well,
but
talking
in
about
Acts,
things that have no factual basis. Let me get you to comment on this if you can. One of the variations of mythicism that I didn't find addressed directly in the book was the very popular YouTube video that eventually got
Zeitgeist.
Zeitgeist, the film, that basically got so popular on YouTube that it actually got picked up by Netflix. And so the who was it? Bill Maher, the comedian, parrots a lot of this, and some of his joke in his movie that he did, Attacking Christianity, talks about these rising and dying gods, and virtually all the historical information is wrong. And so I didn't see a chapter addressing that or correcting that.
Well, yeah, we do
Can
have
you
one
address
in
the Gerald Massey theories and the Zeitgeist film? What is your
That's
opinion of
pretty
that? Is it
dubious. I've only
is it
seen that recently for the first time. It's pretty slipshod, but we do have a chapter by Derek Bennett on the dying and rising gods.
I did see that, but it did not seem to address the terrible inaccuracies based on Gerald Massey, the self-styled Egyptologist, that were picked up from 100 years ago and recycled in Zeitgeist, the movie,
Yeah, I
and then
have
again.
big questions about Massey myself, and there's several, like Kelsey something or other wrote a book called The World's 16 Crucified Saviors. He didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah, well, that's. I'm glad that you said that, and I assumed that you would. And I've noticed that Richard Carrier has backed way away from the Zeitgeist debacle. Another one, I mean, we're going to disagree on this one, probably, Bob, but I felt like even the mythicists really jumped the shark on this, and that would be this whole idea of John Allegro and the sacred mushroom and the cross, where you have this Dead Sea Scroll scholar, legitimate scholar in Semitic languages, a translator of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who writes a book that ends up ruining his career. He had to resign, forced resignation, called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, in which he says or makes the case that the early Christian church was actually a fertility sex cult, and that the people were using hallucinogenics, mushrooms, as like a sacrament, and they were having altered states of consciousness, and that actually Jesus was a myth. There was no man Jesus, but it was a code word for this particular type of psychedelic mushroom. And so this is, of course, when Jesus says, unless you eat of my body, you will not see the kingdom of God. Now we know what that really means. Unless you partake of the mushroom and have an altered state of consciousness, you really won't know what the kingdom of God's really about until you're tripping. So again, I read this torturous chapter in your book, trying to tie in this theory to a 13th century fresco of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden that was found in a French church somewhere, and whether or not this somehow supports the case. And to me, that's when you have someone so skeptical that they're not taking early documents written by people who were close to the situation, and they have no faith in that, but then they're saying, well, 2,000 years later, we really, with no evidence whatsoever, can say we know for certain that this was actually a hallucinogenic sex cult. I mean,
Yeah.
to you, that's not jumping the shark.
Well, that's exceedingly improbable. But since it did have a kind of notoriety and actually has a renewed following today, I figured, well, this ought to be in the book for people to decide what they think of it. I don't think it's likely at all, though the book does have some interesting information in it, but not really, in my view, a cogent case.
Well, it did make the case that there are religions that do that,
Yes,
and that is true. It's very similar to maybe the Native American peyote religions and stuff, and you can see that the idea of even marijuana used as a sacrament. So religions do that kind of thing. So, but to say that that is the real identity of Jesus, I mean, it's like based on what flimsy evidence?
No, I agree, and I think one a big problem. I mean, the whole thing is so outrageous. Though that doesn't prove it's not true, but I don't think it is anyway. The one big problem is that it's based on something like an allegorizing exegesis. That Allegro, no pun intended, allegories. He is saying that when they use this word, they're really thinking of so and so with the mushroom. If that kind of thing, even if it were true, the people that hid the truth behind the symbolism and so on did such a good job of hiding it. There's no longer any reason to believe it. And I think that's true with a lot of theories, that we don't know that you have discovered the key to the meaning of these words. I mean, you could be right, but you better have some more solid reason to think so.
I love it, the internet conspiracies, when this guy is going to tell you what the Illuminati is really all about and what their plans are for world domination. He's a janitor, or lives in his mother's basement, but he's figured out the Illuminati, right? This is some of this. To be honest with you, Bob, some of those theories, it doesn't sound that far removed from the lunatic fringe conspiracy theories that I read.
Oh, I agree. I just figured we want to show the variety of them. I don't mind showing embarrassing ones, because I don't hold a party line, United Front for Mythicism.
Hey, guys, do we have anybody with some questions for us?
I do. I've got one, and then we've got a couple in the chat.
Great.
Hi, Bob. My name's Dan. I work for Watchman. James is my boss. So just to lay that out there. Thanks for coming on tonight. It's great to have you. My question is, I know you're very thorough, so my question is going to be a little thorough. I'm going to take a minute to unpack it, and then I'll just let you comment on what you say. In your book, it's your chapter on chapter 12, Jesus pre-existent and non-existent. And on page 303, you have this quote. You say, in the midst of other things, you're making some parallels. You say this: Luke's story of Jesus and his disciples on the Emmaus Road, which is Luke 24, is startlingly parallel to a well-known story of Asclepius revealing himself to a couple on the road home and healing the wife who had been disappointed of a miracle back in the god Epidaurus' shrine. And then you have a footnote for that, the Epidaurus stele, stele 2, verse 25. And I wanted to read that just for context. And then I wanted to have you explain how you see the startling parallel. So I just read the stele. It's not that long, but I just want to read the stele that it's not in your book, but here's what the stele translated said. Sostrata, a woman of Pherae, was pregnant with worms. Being in a very bad way, she was carried into the sanctuary and slept there. But when she saw no distinct dream, she let herself be carried back home. Then, however, near a place called Kornoi, a man of fine appearance seemed to come upon her and her companions. When he had learned from them about their bad luck, he asked them to set down the ground the litter on which they were carrying Sostrata. Then he cut open her abdomen and took out a great quantity of worms, 2 wash basins full. After having stitched up her belly again, made the woman well. Asclepius revealed to her his presence and enjoined her to send thank offerings for her treatment of Epidaurus. Now, that is believed to have come from the 4th century BC. And the quote, that reminded me, Bob, and I'll finish with this and I'll let you explain. That reminded me of something that Maurice Casey had said in his book, Jesus, Evidence and Arguments, or Mythicist Myths. Casey cites the scholar Sandemel. I don't know if you're familiar with Samuel Sandemel. Sandemel, in a 1962 article, defined what he called parallelomania. That is an extravagance among scholars who first overdoes the supposed similarity in passages and then proceeds to describe source and derivation as if implying literary connection flowing in an inevitable or predetermined direction. And I thought that's exactly what that quote that you said, making that connection between the Emmaus Road and the Epidaurus stele. Could you explain in more detail how do you think that's startlingly related, especially with the gap of 400 years or so?
Well, we still know about it, and it was publicly displayed in one of the Asclepia, the healing shrines, the one in Epidaurus. And we still know it because they had as commercials, like testimonies on the walls of the thing, these stories by satisfied customers. Some of them couldn't possibly have been true, but nonetheless. And so it's no surprise that since we know it, it's not that surprising ancient writers would have known it. So I don't see a problem there. Sandmel, something about him I better not say. He coined the term parallelomania, but in context, what he meant by it, which everybody seems to forget when they throw the word around, is if you have one text that is fragmentary, but as far as it goes, it runs parallel to equivalent stuff in the other one. But if it actually ended the same way, we don't know, since we don't actually have any concluding text. And so we have no right to assume that if it's parallel this far, it must be all the way. That's what he called parallelomania. But ever since then, apologists who hate parallels because they know that they're kind of threatening to some of their arguments, will say that, oh, any appeal to parallel narratives is just maniacal. It's parallelomania.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I would like specifically more than just, hey, this stele looks like this story.
I'll be happy to. I just thought it was good to get what parallelomania is supposed to be and what it isn't.
Sure. I mean,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, to do it justice, Maurice Casey goes into more detail about it. I was just being short for the time sake that we have. But yeah, what is the detail that connects 400 years between Luke and Epidaurus stele? How do we know that Luke? I know he was a physician. Are we going to say that he was a physician? He knew of the stele, and so he decided to copy that story into this form in Emmaus Road. What is the deliberate connection that is being made there that you see?
Well, it's analogous to the thing I said about the Bacchae of Euripides and Second Maccabees. It's like a genre argument. It's so much like it, we don't really know if it was borrowed, though it might well have been. I mean, these other sources were very old, but available even today. But the parallels, as I see them, you have a group of people, one of whom was hoping for deliverance from this delayed pregnancy. She didn't know it was worms. I mean, they're blurting that out at the beginning of the thing, but they're disappointed. She should have been able to go into the chamber where she would dream an epiphany of Asclepius, who would tell her something to do or actually do the trick. It's different in different stories. And then she would leave with her desire met. She would have had the baby. Nothing happened, though. So she, disappointed, she goes home with her family, I guess, her husband. And on the road back home, suddenly this guy pops up who turns out to be a god in disguise, who says, oh, I think I can help here, ma'am. And in this case, he does the miracle on the spot. In Luke 24, he explains why they're wrong to be disappointed. And then he's gone. Presumably, Asclepius didn't go home with him for lunch as Jesus did with the Emmaus disciples, but that seems pretty darn parallel to me. It's the same sort of a story. And so the burden of proof is on the person that would say the one must be true and the other, it's just a story.
So, Robert, would you say, like Richard Carrier, that like with Romulus, it shows all roads lead out of Rome, and the Emmaus story was to show that all roads lead into Jerusalem?
That's not unlikely because
Right.
if you look through the rest of Acts, there is this pattern that everything has to come from Rome. Like, why on earth do the Samaritan converts were baptized not receive the Holy Spirit on the spot? Why doesn't happen with Cornelius, et cetera, et cetera? He's not even baptized yet. Well, they have to call up the guys in Jerusalem in the home office, and they send two apostles. Philip isn't one. And so they lay hands on them, and bingo, it doesn't even fit the way Luke ordinarily describes conversion. So you have to ask why. Well, it looks like it's gotta be done at the hands of the ultimate Jerusalem authorities. So I think he's probably right about that. Not that it weighs especially on this story, but the thing is, Emmaus isn't that far, and Luke has omitted reference to Galilean resurrection appearances, whereas like in Mark, the angel said, "Remember how he said you would meet him again in Galilee." But in Luke, it says, "Remember how when he was in Galilee, he said he would meet you again." If you read further in Luke, they don't go to Galilee. In Mark, they're supposed to, but we don't hear if they did or not because they didn't get the message. But this Matthew doesn't have that. He has the women tell the message to the apostles, go to Galilee, and they do. Why does Luke change that? Well, because he's got this motif that continues on through Christian history. Why is the Catholic Church so nervous about apparitions of the Virgin Mary all over the place? Well, they don't want rival satellites of religious authority. Who knows what those kids may say Mary said? So we got to check it out pretty well. This is why in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the bishops of Catholic churches in the cities would go dig up the remains of martyrs and rebury them in the city because they were becoming independent satellites where people would have Eucharists. And he said, no, we got to have this under our thumb. It's a common sort of an ecclesiastical political thing. It's not surprising that Luke is already doing that.
So, Bob, just to clarify, that your connection is it just looks to you like it's the same story? Is that pretty much it?
Well, basically close enough.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
Again, it's not necessarily that Luke has copied it, though he might have, but it's just this implies this is the kind of story this is. Are you going to insist that the one in Luke is factual, but this one from Asclepius is some zany exaggeration? I don't see what's so different about it.
Well, it seems a better one would be in Elijah, where Elijah's being fed by the ravens or whatever, and then you have the feeding of the 5,000. Isn't that a closer parallel?
Well, I don't think so. I think what you do have there is in Mark, it says that the angels ministered to him. I think that's parallel to Elijah in that when it says the angels ministered, it no doubt means they fed him. But we don't read it that way because we insist on reading Matthew and Luke into Mark, where Mark does not say Jesus fasted the whole time. And I think he says the opposite. Angels fed him as they did Elijah. So that is a close parallel.
But in Matthew, it has a feeding of 5,000 and a feeding of 4. Didn't they have two traditions and Matthew just slammed them together? Doesn't that show that there is a core oral tradition?
Yeah, I think, well, now, Dennis MacDonald thinks that Mark was copying the Odyssey at that point because there are two distinct, somewhat similarly described outdoor feast scenes. I'm not so sure of that. It could be right, but I think it's more likely that it's two tellings of the same story with different numbers, because that's easily the thing people are going to confuse. And one reason I think that is that what is more miraculous than the feeding is the obtuseness of the disciples. They're in the same situation. They say, how are we going to feed these people? Hey, stupid, what did we just do in the last chapter? It just seems to me that Mark did not dare to tamper with either version because somebody would be irate if their favorite was left out. And so there was a common tradition, but that doesn't mean it goes all the way back to a historical event.
Hey, Daniel, I've got a video I'd like to share later, but I wanted to give some more people some time to ask questions if we've got anyone.
Yeah,
I
our
have-
next.
Go ahead, Brady.
Well, we got about 3 people right now waiting.
No, go ahead. No,
let's try to get to one of them
I'm good.
because they've
I'm
been
good.
waiting a while. Seb, I think I'm saying that right. SEB, if you want to go ahead and on it. There you go. It's all you, bud.
Hey guys, I was invited by Bill. Hi, Bill.
Hey,
Finally made it.
good.
So I'm enjoying the discussion very much. And so I have a question. I think part of the difficulty in discussing something like this is the fact that Jesus is such a polarizing figure. So I was wondering, my question is similar to Phil Blair's here in that, can we take another historical figure and walk through the process? I mean, is there an academic process to determine what is historical, what was true, what was real, and what was not? Because if there is such a process, I'm not familiar with it. I knew some historical or some history majors in college, but all I really know about them is that they went to a lot more parties than the engineering students. So can anybody tell me?
I'm thinking Apollonius of Tyana. What do you think, Robert?
What about Apollonius?
Apollonius seems to be a parallel of Jesus.
Oh yeah, in many, many ways.
Or if I may just suggest one last thing, maybe we can talk about William the Bastard or King Arthur or Robin Hood or Cleopatra, any one of these figures that are really not polarizing. How do we determine what was real and what was not?
Good question. Yeah.
Well, the main thing I think with a case like Jesus or Apollonius or the Buddha is the principle of analogy that Ernst Troeltsch enunciated. He said that we weren't there to see any of these people or whatever they did. That's not going to change unless somebody invents a time machine. Probably Elon Musk has one in the works right now. But until that happens, we don't know and we can't know. But so what can we do? Well, we can render judgments of probability or improbability. And the way we do that is the thing reported analogous to things that are reliably attested today? If they are, well, yeah, there's no real problem accepting it. And for instance, even Rudolf Bultmann said, how about the healings and exorcisms? Well, there are churches you can go to today and see these things happen. I mean, you explain them as you will, but there's no problem suggesting Jesus or other ancients did this. And Bultmann said Jesus must have understood himself as a miracle worker. He was not a mythicist, of course. But with walking on the water, changing water into wine and so forth, rising from the dead. Are these things, do they match up with anything? Well, not really. So what are you going to conclude? Well, you can't rule it out. You weren't there. But as a historian, you've got to say this, I would have to say, is improbable. Now, of course, the theological answer to that, which Karl Bart, who's no dummy, gave, he said, well, yeah, of course not, because we're talking about unparalleled acts of God. So even if they did happen, as Bart believed they had, you wouldn't be able to reconstruct a case for it historically. There's just no point in the apologetics, even if it's true. But so then, if you agree with that, how is it you propose to know this? A historian doesn't. He says, here's the probability as I see it. Maybe somebody will walk on water and we'll have to say, wow, I don't know how he did it, but that does make me take a second look at this gospel story, right? Well, to think that in the absence of something like that, you know it by faith, that is a strange epistemology. That seems to me very much like people like Rudolf Steiner, who thought he knew what happened in ancient Atlantis because he had visions and intuitions about it. He didn't have knowledge. He thought he did. And I think knowing his supposed Historical assertion by faith is not knowledge, and it's intellectually dishonest. You can't really, as Tillich said, faith really has nothing to do with what may have happened historically or scientifically. One final illustration of this that I like, because I made it up. Suppose you come in from a hard day's work, you sit down on this couch and you just randomly turn on the TV, and the first thing you see is a giant dinosaur stomping buildings into matchsticks. What is your first reaction? Oh, I guess this is Fox News or CNN. No, you wouldn't think that. You would, I mean, it's conceivable, I guess, but you would automatically think, oh, this is the Sci-Fi Channel. I know what this is. It's a Toho Studios movie. Well, you don't know it for certain in that moment. But what is it? What are the chances that it's more like news than a cheap monster movie? It seems to fit the one, not the other. So you'd have to say, I'd say it's pretty probable this is just one more Toho movie. And I think it's the same principle here. You don't know what did or didn't happen. You weren't there. So what are you going to say? Well, probability, probably not, but who knows?
So why is Apollonius, who healed people, who rose people from the dead, who had followers, who was transported across the Mediterranean to see, why is he historical and Jesus not?
I don't think he is. I did an article a few years ago where I tried to show that if you look closely, as I did, into the stories in the life of Apollonius, that they seem to be fictitious, and the statements about the sources from the memoirs of Damas, the disciple, these things seem to be just literary flourishes, and so that and there are such similarities, like in the nativity of Apollonius. There's so much like the extravagant nativity stories of the Buddha. I mean, far outclassing Jesus or Moses. I think you really don't have a historical figure here. At least if you do, it's lost to us.
Let me ask you something, Bob. Can we, about your historical epistemology, can we know any figure in history, in ancient history, for certain existed, or are you really skeptical about any knowledge of the past, since it can't be observed, it can't be duplicated, repeated in a laboratory setting? Can we know any historical truth?
We can know it well enough if it's not very problematical. Like, for instance, in 1,000 years, it's conceivable records will be such a mess that people will en masse start denying that the Holocaust happened. Of course, they're nuts now that say that. Well, at this stage in history, I know it happened because my father, who was in Patton's Third Army, was present at the liberation of Dachau. I've heard him describe it. I have some war souvenirs of his from the war. I have a memoir he wrote about it. There's no doubt in my mind. There's no room for doubt. But it's possible, God forbid, that one day such evidence will have vanished and people will find it hard to believe. So, but if something is not inherently problematical, I think you're safe in saying, yeah, as far as we know, no reason to doubt that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the Ides of March. Most of it, you don't know that some weird thing may turn up, but or how about the Hitler diaries, if you remember that from 30 plus years ago? Some guy said that these diaries of Uncle Adolf were discovered that showed, though he was a rat, he wasn't quite as odious a rat as we thought. And Hugh Trevor Roper, a big-time historian, said, wow, this is an important find, and so on. And then a couple of weeks later, it turns out it's a forgery. Well, at least that he was willing to revise what he assumed was self-evidently true if there were good evidence. And he was equally willing to say, whoops, I made a mistake there. That turned out this is fake. But usually...
Speaking of being willing to revise, that's a good illustration. How much of this is like a priori, we're assuming like an anti-supernatural bias because
None
we
of
know
it.
miracles can't happen. Then we know this is, you
I
call them
do not
problematic.
know miracles can't happen.
But you were
There's
talking about
no way.
problematic areas of the like the gospel narratives, okay?
If it's
And I'm assuming you were
outrageous.
meaning walking on water being one of them. Let's
Isn't
say.
that problematical? I mean, you see, if you say there is a God, as there may well be, God could do anything. But
That's my question. That's my question for
Yeah,
you.
but
If
that
if
doesn't
if you
mean
had that
it-
as a given, I know you don't, and
no, no,
and maybe I
listen.
shouldn't, but if you
No.
accept
Let's
that a God
assume there is
exists.
an almighty God who can do anything he wants. That doesn't mean he actually did everything anybody claims he did. In fact, when this is brought up, the anti-supernatural bias, what they really mean is you lack a bias, namely the belief in biblical infallibility. Because otherwise you wouldn't doubt any biblical miracles. Hey, no, God may well be a miracle working deity, but how about the story where Samson kills 1,000 men with a bone? What, did they all line up? You know, wham, next, wham, next. I mean, there's something about the story, not the fact that he had superhuman strength and killed a bunch of people, but if you envision the story, or the guys looking into the Ark of the Covenant, thousands of them die. Again, what did they do? Just kick aside the bodies and go take their own look and die? Somebody just hasn't thought out the story, and it reveals it as just a story.
Yeah, I think I agree with you a lot of that. You know, we all come with our biases, you know, and so and we've talked about this a lot in the book club about how we can take the identical set of evidences and we're going to interpret that. Because I'm a theist, I'm going to interpret it exactly the opposite of you taking that same body of evidence and applying, you know, your criteria to it. You come up with the opposite, but we're looking at the same
I think that's a cop
set of
out.
facts.
That doesn't make this ridiculous thing of Samson killing people lining up to die any more plausible. Did God hypnotize them all to do that? I mean, then we're getting into did Jonah have a pad and pen when he was in the belly of the whale to write that psalm? It just, or how did Noah get all the critters on the ark? Did he have Brainiac's Shrink Ray from Superman comics? It just doesn't hold together because of the way it's written and what the conceptions of the writer were. It's not that there can't be any miracles. How the heck could any mortal know that? I don't. It's just that there's something about the story that is problematic, and you cannot just give the benefit of the doubt all the time to, well, if God could do everything, then everything in the Bible is accurate historically. How do you know that? That doesn't follow from there being an omnipotent God. It follows from a particular doctrine of inspiration, which I don't see fits the facts, but even if it does, it doesn't dictate stuff like this.
But Dr. Price, in Mark 6, it says that Jesus could not do any miracles in his hometown. So it shows that the gospel writers did have some respect for the historical accuracy of the...
Not necessarily, because the point is that he's rejected there. And in fact, in the beginning of the story, Bultmann shows this, it looks like Mark had two pieces of tradition. One in which Jesus goes to the synagogue and wows them. And that's where you read, where did he get these wise words? Where did he get these powers? But then he also had a proverb that said, a physician does not cure those who know them, and a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. He said, uh-oh, how do I get these together? So he just jams them together and arbitrarily has the crowd howling for Jesus' blood. Luke figures this is a problem. So he has Jesus diss them and just goad them into hostility. Not that there's any particular reason to do it, but at least that sort of harmonizes it. So it seems to me that, and where do we get this thing where he couldn't heal him? Well, that's tacked on to the end after the story has been reinterpreted to justify the proverb. If it says he couldn't heal those who know him, well, then by golly, he couldn't. But then Matthew didn't like that and said, well, he didn't heal him. He could have healed him, but he decided to punish him. But you have to look at the probable course of evolution of these texts. And plus, you can say, even as it is preserved now, it had a kind of a justifying function for early Christian healers who didn't get the results they hoped for. Well, Jesus couldn't do it every time, so don't worry about it. That's just like after the Transfiguration. Why couldn't we cast the demon out? Well, this kind requires prayer. And then some manuscripts say, and fasting. Well, you know why that is? Because no matter what the thing said, they said, okay, I'm going to try again, just like this Jesus did. I'm going to pray, but it still didn't work. So, well, how about adding and fasting? And they just kept adding to try to, like they did with rain dances. Well, it didn't seem to work. Maybe we should have done the two-step over here. So that's what we'll do next time.
Bob, I have another quick question for you. In relation to you said something in relation to the atoning death and resurrection of Jesus on page 223. Thus began the Gnostic Christian myth of the atoning death and resurrection of Jesus. But if I'm not mistaken, most of the Gnostic texts that we have in the Nag Hammadi are 2nd century, probably 100 years after Paul. And I'm thinking of Paul in Corinthians writing in the 50s. But I wanted to ask you something that Larry Hurtado and Craig Keener have mentioned in relation to the crucifixion of Jesus. And I didn't quite know what you meant by the Gnostic Christian myth of the atoning death. And I only know of the Gnostic writings from the 2nd century, but I wanted to quote something from Craig Keener and have you comment on it. And this is from Keener's 4-volume work on Acts. Keener says the cross required little explanation for Luke's audience. It was well known in their world, though undoubtedly less common in Achaia, Macedonia, and the province of Asia in this period, 1st century, than in more troublesome provinces such as Judea. Jesus' crucifixion by the Romans outside Jerusalem is an almost indisputable historical fact. Early Christians would not have invented the crucifixion. Crucifixion was treated as appropriate for cases of treason against the majesty of the emperor, for revolutionaries, that is, for political cases. And this is undoubtedly the basis for Jesus' crucifixion, since he is called King of the Jews in Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John, a charge his followers would hardly dare invent in the 1st century Roman world, especially in the reign of Tiberius, unless all were deliberately suicidal. So how do you, as a mythicist, how do you explain the event of the crucifixion where most scholars accept it as a reality that a real person named Jesus was crucified under Pilate during the reign of Tiberius in Jerusalem?
Well, I'd like to point out that in Jesus' case, most scholars agreed that he was a blasphemer and should be put to death. Should we say that consensus rules? The whole idea is that in the Gospels, it's said to be a big frame up, that Jesus is falsely accused of this, and that's how he gets crucified. But as Luke says in Acts, God reversed it. You can't keep a good man down. It's not like it ends with the crucifixion. Right. The whole thing is a build-up to the resurrection. So it's the darkness before the dawn. People are making up stories like that all the time.
So you're saying that the historicity of the crucifixion is a made-up story?
It's not unlikely, since there are such similar, admittedly made-up stories in contemporary Greco-Roman novels.
Okay, so are you saying that this is historical fiction from the 1st century? Is that
it might well be, but I think the Gospels all stem from the 2nd century.
Okay. And then one last. Oh, go ahead, James. I'm done.
Well,
I'm done.
If you're done, okay, give me a date for Mark.
I think probably 120, 130. And I know that.
When do you date P52, the John Ryland fragment? What date do you put on the fragment of John's Gospel?
Well, now that's been reopened, and people say that it might be a 4th century manuscript. I don't know. I'm not a paleographer.
That's what you get, James.
But that is.
I'm certainly not familiar with that. I've heard them push to 175, but
Yeah, 125.
125 to 150 is the traditional date.
Well,
that they
as
put on.
my conservative friends love to say to me, "Oh, that's passe. It's not taken for granted anymore." I'll send you the link or the actual article about
Thanks, Bob.
why the paleography thing has certain problems with it.
Yes.
But I think the basis for my dating it that late is there are several different attempts within Mark to explain repeated delays of the parousia, which, for instance, but the end is not yet. The gospel first must be preached both to all the nations. But as to that day and hour, nobody knows, not even me. This generation will not pass. And then there are some standing here. Oh, well, it was the transfiguration after all. It's obvious to me that these things are attempts to apologize for the delay of it, exactly like in 2 Peter, though that writer has the most reasonable one, where though it's caricatured unintentionally often, he says, scoffers will come and say, where's this coming he promised? Ever since the fathers fell asleep, everything keeps going the way it always has. And he says, hey, look, smart guy, don't you realize that for God, a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day? Well, I've heard Christians say, aha, you see, Jesus was talking about God's clock, and he didn't mean according to your sense of time. That's just outrageously stupid. It makes Jesus a hoaxer. It's clear what 2 Peter means is, look, all right, it's been delayed, but don't you see why? God doesn't, he's got all the time in the world, and he's given you extra time to repent, which you'd better do. I mean, that's reasonable, right? But there are a bunch of sort of strained ones in Mark.
We have another question. Anybody had lined up?
Yes, Mike is next. Mike Cahill.
Okay. Could you unmute for us?
No, Mike.
Yeah.
Oh, there he is.
As a former academic, I have concerns about some of the easily dismissing stuff you don't like. Specifically, it's really a bit much as a person with two doctorates. People who put faith in you to give you 2 doctorates, to hear you just easily dismiss everything in the past, and James touched on that. You just said, I'd like to finish my point. I'm a little tired, so I may not be very coherent here. I found so much of what you're saying to be incredible. It just seems to be a bit much to anything that happened in the past, that like a miracle or anything like that, you easily dismiss as clearly not right. And doesn't that really show a tremendous anti-supernatural bias?
No, it does not. I can repeat what I said, but you're slandering me when you say that. I'm just a bigoted anti-supernatural.
I never slandered you, sir. I'm saying I disagree. I'm saying no.
You're saying more than that.
Okay, well, how did I slander you, sir?
That is anti-supernaturalist bias. I've tried to explain.
That's the way it seems. That's the way it seems.
I tried to explain the principle of analogy. We don't know what did and didn't happen, but since you weren't there, what can you do but render a probabilistic judgment, probable or improbable?
Well, I thought you said a minute ago that there were things we could know about ancient characters. Now you're saying we cannot?
I'm saying it's a question of whether there is any analogy to a tested contemporary experience.
Well, how would you... What does that mean? I'm a decently smart guy, and I have no idea what you're saying to me.
Well, we never see anybody walk on water. We never see anybody ascend into the sky and be covered by a cloud. We never see anybody take a can of tuna and some crackers and feed thousands of people. We don't see various things that are in the Gospels. So we don't know that they didn't happen. We weren't there. But when you have something like that stated with no known parallel, what are you going to conclude provisionally? That probably didn't happen.
Well, that is unless you have a prior belief. Your worldview determines whether things are possible, right?
No, sir.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
It doesn't. Let me tell you.
It doesn't. Oh, that's because you say so. No, I'm serious. I'd like to explain myself because you've accused me of slandering you, and I have no interest in slandering you. I just have an interest in understanding what is seeming confused. Maybe I'm not thinking correctly. So isn't it true that a person's worldview does determine how they view reality, and it also determines the possibility of what can happen? So myself as a theist, and I believe in theism not because the Bible says so, and your pejorative language at times does come through, sir. It seems to me. I may be wrong. But nevertheless, I hope so. But nevertheless, the truth of the matter is, as a person who has, because of philosophical reasons, a commitment to monotheism, then it seems possible that there could be supernatural things occur in the past, and I don't easily dismiss them per se just because, I don't see it happening today.
Didn't I say that? I don't say it. We know.
I didn't. Maybe I'm just not hearing correctly, and I apologize if I didn't.
Yeah, I said if there is an all-powerful God, as there may well be, he could do anything, but that doesn't mean he did whatever anybody ever said he did. He might have, he might not. That's
nobody's ever saying that.
Oh yeah, they are. They're
anybody that's credible doesn't say that. Right.
Let's do this, and I think what Dr. Price is saying is that if there is a God, it does certainly open the door for the possibility of miracles, but it doesn't prove that every claim of miracles necessarily happened. And so if you're coming, and I think Mike, you're right, that if you're coming from a purely physical atheistic worldview, naturalistic worldview, then the tendency is going to be naturally to dismiss any account of a miracle as being either impossible or virtually impossible. So at best that is not your position, Dr. Price, but I think Mike is right that your worldview can help to determine how you're going to approach that kind of thing. So even David Hume did not say miracles were impossible. He just defined the problem to such a degree that any reasonable person would never have enough evidence to be able to know that one did happen. So Dr. Price is kind of have a middle ground. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems to be that you're not dismissing the possibility of miracles, only to say that it's easier to take a natural event and say it probably happened than to take a miraculous event and say it probably happened. So it's a probability issue rather than a possibility issue.
Mm-hmm. And
is that fair?
Price, didn't the demythologizers, Boltzmann, say these things obviously didn't happen?
Well, he said that history, he was pretty much saying the same thing Trelch did, that given historical methodology, you can't render it probable, but that is why he said you could render probable that Jesus could be seen casting out demons and healing people. However you think he did it, who knows? But that's you see that today. There's why shouldn't he have done it?
And Bart Ehrman says the same thing. He says, as a historian, he makes this very clear: you cannot prove the supernatural. Although it might be possible, you can't prove it historically, is what he says.
And what was the name? I didn't hear. Who said that?
Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Let me do this if I can. Do we have another question in the queue, or could I go back and do my video?
We do have one more by Phil.
Let's get to Phil first.
Okay.
Well, Seb actually pretty much asked the questions that I was going to ask. He just used different terminology to ask them. So if I could just comment a little bit on some of the answers that you gave to Seb. And the first one is that my observation is that that branding a certain account as problematic seems to me to be completely subjective. I don't hear any objective arguments for labeling a specific narrative as problematic. it seems to me that it's just a fancy way of saying that it bothers that there are certain elements in these stories that wouldn't make sense, or that shouldn't make sense, or that may not seem to you to be likely or to be probable. And the other problem that I'm seeing is that that I don't know anyone who has ever offered the fact that there could be a powerful God up there and he could perform miracles. I don't see anybody using that as evidence for any specific miracles in the New Testament. I've never seen that argument ever. So it seems like there's a straw man going on here where we're saying, well, just because there's a God, there could be a God, just because there could be miracles, doesn't mean that these specific miracles occurred. Well, nobody's arguing that. The argument for the historicity of the New Testament is based on historical arguments. It's historiography. It's not based on just a vague sense of, well, there's supernatural could occur, so therefore these things occur. So this argument from probability seems to be really problematic, if I can use the word, if I can borrow your terminology, because out of the hundreds of millions of people in this country right now, the probability that you and I are talking to each other right now is unbelievably, astronomically improbable. Yet here we are talking. So, and when somebody asks me, do you think Jesus rose from the dead? Do you think Jesus existed? Do you think Jesus walked on water? I would say he probably didn't, because it's very improbable that Jesus rose from the dead, that he walked on water, that these things may be true. But the fact that they're improbable doesn't mean they're false. So the only thing that we can do is examine the historical evidence and do it in such a way that that we're fair to the historical data, just like we're fair to the historical data about Socrates. And there's far more evidence for the existence of Jesus than there is for the existence of Socrates. So I'm curious as to how you would respond to my challenge that I think that a lot of this idea of being problematic and the analogy to something that takes place today. There's lots of things that occurred in history that have no analogy to what we're seeing today. But that doesn't mean that we should dismiss them and cast doubt over whether or not they're historical. So I'm looking for some kind of objective criteria here that moves this discussion out of the domain of the subjective and puts it into the domain of at least some semblance of objectivity. And so far, I haven't seen any of that.
So what do you think of that, Dr. Price?
I'm baffled. I think the whole idea of the principle of analogy is anything but subjective. There are or there are not cases of somebody miraculously multiplying food. And if there are not, then a story in which it happens is problematic. And as I have said many, many times tonight, that doesn't mean we know it didn't happen. It's just that, as you say, like probability, the notion that if someone were to say, not seeing this program, that this guy and that guy, I bet you somewhere they're conversing. Oh, that would be a wild shot in the dark, but could nonetheless be true. But then I'm admitting, as Karl Bart did, that you may not be able to call a miracle, namely a unique event, probable, because it's a unique event. How would you verify it? And that doesn't mean it didn't happen. As Karl Bart said, he certainly believed it did, but he said it's not a matter of proving it. He admitted it was subjective, and I do question the validity of that, but at least I think he was straightforward about it and consistent. I have, as to whether it's a straw man, I have heard to say that some are saying that because God could have done A, he did A. I have read and heard many times for decades apologists say you deny this, that, and the other miracle only because you're an anti-supernaturalist who rules it out from square one. How many times do I have to say that I do not? I don't know what can happen in the big bad universe. There's no way I could know that. So I don't dismiss anything. If somebody tells me they were miraculously healed, I say, great, I'm glad to hear it. I don't know really exactly what happened, but I don't think they're lying. And when I hear about healings in the past, I don't scoff at that. But something is surely problematic if the story is incoherent. Strauss asked about the miraculous multiplication of bread. He said, what is it we're supposed to be picturing here? Did Jesus take a piece of bread and tear it in half like somebody ripping a sponge apart, and then each half grew to be a whole one, and then he tore those? They don't really tell you. It's just like in the book of Revelation, where it says that as the Lamb takes one seal off after another, you see more and more of the scroll. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, this is a silly thing. People understandably don't even notice, but if there's an up and down sequence of seals on a scroll, you're not going to be able to see anything if you take only one off. You got to take them off. In other words, it's not important really for the content of the book, but somebody hasn't thought through the image, and therefore it seems it's incoherent and problematic. Samson, did he kill all these Philistines one by one as they stood in line waiting? What are you talking about? Could he have killed them all if they trapped him in a huge crowd? I don't think that would work either logistically. So whoever told that story was like telling a fairy tale. It didn't occur to him what would have to have happened. And the same thing with some of the other ones. As stories, they fail. It's not even a miraculous element.
But Dr. Price, in Matthew's account of Jesus walking on the water, he has Peter fail. Peter does not succeed, and he loses faith, which is not very flattering to Peter. So if you were making it up, and of course Mark doesn't have Peter walking on water, he only has Jesus walking on the water. But the thing is, if you were making it up, wouldn't you have Peter just go and walk on the water, give Jesus a high five? Doesn't it have some historical plausibility?
Well, no, because why does no one else record it? Just running short on ink? I mean, this is sort of a big thing, and it makes a lot of sense to me, though I don't know. I'm not going to have a seance and try to call up Matthew and ask him. But as one scholar has argued, somebody didn't like Peter very much and had him sink, because that made him a faithless schmuck like the rest of us. And the whole thing becomes a very striking object lesson in don't take your eyes off Jesus no matter what is happening around you.
Our short answer on that question, Dr. Price, is that it would seem that if, in the case of no multiple attestation, it's a no-win situation. If it's recorded in all four Gospels, it's plagiarism, and if it's only in one of the Gospels, then there's no multiple attestation. Yeah, copying from Mark, you don't have multiple attestation because everybody's just copying Mark. So, and if you do have it, then it's either plagiarism, yeah. But let me get that video. I want you to comment on if I could do that, because we're almost out of time. I really appreciate your patience with us and being willing to take the questions. And let me pull this up just a second here. It's a video from Bart Ehrman, which we may have already heard. You may have already had more Bart Ehrman than you cared to have at this point. We had watched 2.5 hours, a 2.5 hour debate that you guys had. But I did want to ask you to comment. This is a short little clip from Bart. See if I can find the play here. Yeah, here we go. I won't read it to you. Let me just read this. Bart, a couple of years ago, received the Freedom from Religion Foundation Man of the Year Award, the Emperor Has No Clothes Award. And when he's receiving the award, somebody shouts out that there's no evidence for historical Jesus. And he had this comment to make to the group, and then I'd like you to comment on it before we run completely out of time.
I do not see evidence in archaeology or history for a historical Jesus.
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. Well, I mean, okay, yeah. I mean, I have a whole book on it. I mean, so there is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence that it is not. I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who. I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that is not evidence. That is not evidence. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. But if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar in every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you've got a different opinion, you better have a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically, rather than coming up with the theory that Jesus didn't exist. Sorry.
So I don't know if you had already seen that or not, but could you just comment on that for us, Dr. Price?
He appeals big time to the fallacy of appealing to consensus, though he immediately says, "Oh, that's irrelevant." Though, of course, that's pretty ridiculous, since that's the essence of his case. You know why there are no mythicists in the faculty of these institutions? As Bart says in his book, Did Jesus Exist? If you heard an applicant had that theory, that would be it. You wouldn't even consider him. So there's a kind of a circularity here. I don't think he understands enough of the problems with the evidence that he's so proud of. And I would invite anybody who does want to pursue both sides of this to read my book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted, which is not polemical or nasty, but it deals with some of, I think, the flagrant fallacies in his argument.
Speaking of that, I know we're out of time. It's a real quick, and maybe we can talk about this some other time or privately or something. But you were talking about some of the questionable issues on the Josephus quote about Jesus. But there's a second Josephus quote that, to my understanding, even the skeptical scholars consider it to be pretty solid, and that's the James quote. In reference to the brother of Jesus in Josephus. Do you think that that's also an interpolation or a later addition to Josephus?
No, I think it's a misreading. I think Carrier is probably right on that it's talking about a known case of a succession dispute to the high priesthood, that it was supposed to go to James, the son, or Jacob, the son of Damnius, but he was murdered and assassinated by his rivals, led by this guy Ananus. Of course, there are loads of guys named that. And so once the Romans found out about it, they deposed him and gave the job to the next in line, Jesus, son of Damnius, the brother of James. And Jesus is, they refer to him as Jesus, called Christ, but as many scholars say, when they're not talking about this passage, but they are about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they will tell you that a title for the high priest was the Anointed, the Christ. So I think Carrier is right. It is by no means certain that this is even about our Jesus and James. I don't agree with everything Carrier says, but this makes more sense of the passage to me.
A case of mistaken identity of which Jesus and which James that's being talked about.
Yeah, a modern.
And I am familiar with Carrier. Briefly mentioned that when he was with us a couple of years ago. I didn't know that you would concur with him necessarily. But one more thing. First of all, let me say thank you so much for being part of our book club. And I still got a ton of questions. I'm sure other people do as well. But our time is up. I did want to ask you if you'd be so kind before you go to talk a little bit about who is H.P. Lovecraft and your interest in the scholarship of his work, which is also pretty important to you. And then finally, maybe a word of advice for the atheists and the Christians in the club. Thanks again, Dr. Price.
Well, as for advice, I'd say keep up the good work. What you're doing is something incredibly rare, sadly, in this society. So any candle we can light for dialogue, we ought to do it. And you're doing a great job. Lovecraft was a writer of supernatural horror in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe, though with a heavy admixture of Arthur Machen and Lord Dunsany and some others. And he had a philosophy of, he was a mechanistic materialist and kind of a nihilist in the sense that he thought there's no inherent meaning. We're here by accident, and one day the forces of nature will dispense with us as they did the pterodactyl and the trilobite. Nonetheless, life is amply worth living because of the beauty of it. And but that by itself wouldn't compel me. I just find his way with words and his ability to create a sense of the numinous, actually, though he was an atheist, he had the ability to conjure the sense of, like Isaiah in chapter 6, with a vast cosmic scheme. You begin to say, woe is me, I'm nothing. And it's a wholesome thing. And so I love him as a writer.
By the way, James, Ken just came on. You've had a huge impact on my life, Robert, from listening to your videos. I just really love, listening to you. Ken, do you want to say something since, he means so much to you?
You unmute, Ken.
Ken.
Yeah.
Unmute.
There you go.
I'm there.
Your hero's here, Robert Price, my man.
Yeah, so I've had limited correspondence with Dr. Price once or twice, but I was actually in Africa in the year 2000. It was March 2000, and I was searching around for some apologetic books online. This was when we had dial-up in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And so I was searching around. I was struggling because I had read some of the Old Testament. I was having some very much a lot of consternation about my faith, about my commitment to the Bible. I was with Wycliffe Bible translators at the time. And so I searched, somebody told me that Clark Pinnock was a good apologist to look for. So I searched for his name on Google, and I found, instead of his name, I found your book, Beyond Born Again. And so I downloaded it, and I just, I'd never read anything comparable to that in my life. I just only consumed mostly just evangelical Christian literature up to that point. And so it was quite an eye opener, and it kind of set me off into quite a crisis, I guess you could say. And so I went from there, became sort of a liberal Christian for a little bit, then then a deist, and then an agnostic. Kind of still landed as an agnostic, atheist-leaning agnostic. So I credit you for that initial kick in the pants that that I needed to kind of see the light, and the rest is history, I guess.
Wow.
I don't see necessarily eye to eye on all your views, including this view, the topic of this discussion tonight, but I do credit you for the movement in the direction that I've headed towards to this point. So
I really appreciate that. By the way, Clark Pennock, a wonderful man, sadly gone now, a good friend of mine. It's interesting stuff he writes. I always try to make sure people know my goal is to be Socratic, to try to help. Well, I'm not sure he was quite fair, actually, but I try to act as a midwife to get people to do the work themselves, to come up with their own synthesis. And to that end, I'm trying to supply information and perspectives they may not be familiar with. But I do not care in the least if somebody winds up agreeing with me. I'm not trying to make disciples, just to stimulate thinking. And I'm very honored to hear that the effect of that on you.
Before we go, I just want to before we go, say hi to Dr. Bob. Hi, Bob. I just tried to be here. Susan.
Hi. Yes. Oh, good to see you. Wow.
Thank you. I really appreciate how you aren't trying to hit people over the head to believe like you are, and you're trying to be as critical as you can. So anyway, just want to say hi.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And thanks again, Dr. Price. And before we go, I did want to announce our next book club. We do have, for May 5th, we have Justin Bass. Dr. Bass is going to be joining us and talk about his book, The Bedrock of Christianity. It deals with the facts of Jesus' death and resurrection. So this will be our Christian book for next month. That's going to be on May 5th. And this is going to be a book club that we're going to do a hybrid. So we've been mostly doing just Zoom, but this is going to be at the Watchman office in Arlington. So if you're local, come by at 6 o'clock. We'll share a meal together for about an hour. Then at 7 o'clock, we'll start the book club. We will also simulcast that on Zoom. So you can still, if you're not in the area, you can still be part of it. But the genesis of our book club was getting together, sharing a meal, getting to know each other as people, as friends, really, and then having the book club. And we don't want to get too far away from those roots. So if you are in the North Texas area, hopefully you can be there with us for the dinner. And if not, please feel free to join us by Zoom. Go ahead and get the book now, The Bedrock of Christianity by Justin
And James,
Bass.
do you want to tell everybody on Apologetics Profile, we have a two-part interview with Justin on that book. If you can't get the book for whatever reason, go to the Apologetics Profile podcast on Podomatic, and you will find, scroll down to, I think it was last summer, scroll down and you will find Justin Bass and my interview with Justin about his book if you don't have time or the ability to get the book.
Yeah, Justin is PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary. He, before COVID, was living as a missionary in Amman, Jordan, serving refugees through an NGO. He's now professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. He's written several other books in addition to The Bedrock of Christianity. So you'll get to meet him in person either by Zoom or at the book club proper. And we also have a tentative commitment from Dale Allison. We don't have the date down yet, but he has said that he would like to do the book club with us, and so we're working on that date as well now. We've got conversations going on with a couple of other authors that I'm not free to announce right now, but appreciate you being part, everyone who's part of the book club, for being here, for having a respectful conversation, and until next month, take care. Thanks so
Bob.
much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Great to be here.